Good morning and welcome to NIPFP. And it's my privilege and absolute, honor to introduce you to the young economist and the civil service probationers around me. And as you know, he's the former RBI governor, and he was RBI governor during the time in which India was opening up. Today's lecture on inflation and monetary policy, he will be focusing on his experiences about him as RBI governor and also the challenges before the new RBI governor. Two important decisions he has taken. I would love to tell you, but in detail, sir will tell you. Those two decisions were from administered interest rates. India went into deregulation of interest rates, and he was the RBI governor then. The second important institutional reform happened during his phase was from the seigniorage financing of deficits. India has moved to predominantly bond financing of deficits. We controlled monetized deficits. So such big decisions happened during his tenure. And he held many important positions. And of course, it's a homecoming for me. He's our former chairman. And he was in Delhi, he was Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council chairman till 2014 for a long period of time. He was also, at Rajya Sabha as member of parliament. Then in addition to that, our country recognized him with the highest award, Padma Vibhushan. So his contributions are immense. He's a very powerful author. I know that you are aware of his books, and early career he was in US. He did his PhD from University of Pennsylvania. Then he taught there. He also taught at Watson and in New York School, isn't it? He was in, yeah. I was going through his. I did a bit of research about your early career. You taught in New York School, yes. And also he was awarded C.R. Rao Centenary Gold Medal. We young economists had an opportunity to mingle with him when he was president of Indian Econometric Society and Indian Economic Association. And given that, over to you, sir. It's our privilege and absolute honor to be with you today morning. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I propose to speak to you this morning on inflation and monetary policy. I shall initially talk a little bit about what inflation is all about and why we are concerned with inflation, and follow it up with my remarks on monetary policy, and what role does monetary policy play in terms of regulating inflation. I propose to bring in some of our own experience with relation to the control of inflation. So I begin with the question, what is inflation? And as I said, that it is a persistent increase in the general price level, which we must call inflation. There are two things. It is talking about the general price level. It is not talking about the increase in the prices of one or two commodities. Therefore, it is a general price level that is relevant, and it must be persistent. And the first question that we ask is, what causes inflation? There are a number of theories, but there are two broad approaches. One is that it can be caused by what we may call demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation essentially means that the aggregate demand in the economy is higher than the aggregate supply. You can immediately see that if the aggregate demand is higher than aggregate supply, then it leads to a situation in which the prices begin to rise. The other alternative reason for inflation is cost push inflation, as they call it. Cost push inflation essentially means that when the price of an input rises. As a consequence, the total cost of production increases, and that pushes the prices up. For example, wages. If wage rate goes up, then it affects all industries and all economic activities. And as a consequence, the price increases. These are broad approaches. And there are some people who think the cost push inflation is a myth. And there are also people who feel that the cost push and demand pull inflation cannot be separated for a long time. Inflation may be triggered by aggregate demand being higher than aggregate supply, but later on, it can also become a cost push inflation. There is a totally different view on inflation, which is what is called the structural economist approach. The structural economists argue that inflation is due to different segments in the society trying to get a larger share of the total cake than what they had. When I say different segments of the society, it could be wage earners, consumers, entrepreneurs, and so on. If everybody is vying against each other in order to get a larger share in the cake, then that causes inflation. And the other things are all facilitating factors. Well, to go to a totally different view on inflation and the cause of inflation, that is the famous quantity theory of money. You must have all heard about the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money says that the primary cause of inflation is the increase in money or money supply. When money supply increases, then the price level goes up. That was the famous Ewing-Fisher statement or formulation, which said MV is equal to PT. M is money, V is velocity of circulation of money, is equal to P, price level, T, transactions. That is, in the economy, the total value of transactions. So the total value of transactions means transactions multiplied by the general price level is equal to money multiplied by the velocity of circulation of money. That is the number of times the money changes hands. As you see in real life, the currency note that you are holding, when you buy something, you give it to the seller, and the seller then uses the same currency note for another transaction. Therefore, velocity of circulation is the number of times the currency note changes. Therefore, in the economy, the total value of the transactions will be equal to the money supply multiplied by its velocity of circulation. And from this formulation, MV is equal to PT, then what follows is that if V and T are assumed constant, what happens? An increase in M leads to an increase in P. So, in fact, the quantity theory of money made a very strong statement, because if you assume that V and T are constant, an increase in money will lead to a proportionate increase in price level. This is a strong statement to make, that if doubling of the money means doubling of the price level. If you increase money supply by 10%, then the P, the price level, will increase by 10%. It is true that not all believe in this equation. There are problems of computing what is money. There's a lot of discussion in the literature on what constitutes money. Is it only the currency note that deposits, and then other liquidity instruments. But the more point that the quantity theory of money made was that for an increase in price level, there must be an increase in money. So to summarize what I have said, one can look at inflation as a demand pull inflation. It can happen that way. Or it can become a cost push inflation. But according to Irving Fisher, unless there is a change in money supply, there cannot be an overall increase in the general price level. And that is what the quantity theory of money said. Milton Friedman, one of the very famous economists, not necessarily accepted by everyone, made a statement which was, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. There's a famous statement of Milton Friedman, which does not fully adopt the Irving Fisher formulation, but on the other hand, it says that an increase in the price level cannot happen unless there is an increase in money supply. And that is why he said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. There are issues around cost push and demand pull also. How to define aggregate demand and what does cost push, whether the cost push can by itself create inflation or the cost push calls for an increase in money supply and therefore the cost push resulted in the increase in the money supply, which resulted in the price level. I will come back to this particular point later. Let us ask the question, why are you concerned with inflation? Is inflation bad? Therefore, we need to understand the need for the control of inflation. And the need arises because when there is an increase in the general price level, it affects the different sections of the community differently. Look at government employees or employees in the organized sector, and like that, who have a DA formula, that is, a dearness allowance is given, adjusted based upon what is happening to inflation. Therefore, they are compensated for the increase in the prices. Sometimes fully, sometimes may not be fully, but they are compensated. Therefore, they do not get affected that much. But look at the people in the unorganized sector and the poor people. And they get affected because the general price level increases, but their income does not increase, even in monetary terms, and therefore they get hurt. And therefore, the inflation really hits hard the poor. And therefore, the reason for acting on control of inflation. Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was passing away recently, had created a lot of grief. Dr. Manmohan Singh always used to say that control of inflation is going to help the poor. And therefore, that is one approach. And there are other causes also to worry about relating to inflation. What happens to savings? What happens to investment in the economy when there is a general price level increase, when inflation is rampant? Now, people do not want to save very much as a consequence of inflation because today, the value of that 1 rupee is not the same deposited, let's say, in the individuals with respect to saving. Investment also. People are not very keen to invest when there is a continuous increase in price level and there is a continuous inflation. And some people would also argue the consequence of the impact on savings and investment, even the growth rate can be affected. So it hits hard the poor. It may investment. In the case of investment, people would be willing to put their funds into speculative type of investment because they want to get a compensation for the increase in price level. So there are many undesirable effects of inflation, and that is why people want to, or the policymakers do not want the inflation to rise beyond a particular level. And the history of inflation varies from country to country. I will come back to India a little later, but Germany is a country in which there was a period in the interwar period when prices rose so much and the inflation rate was so high that people used to joke saying that people were kept running because the value of the German currency might change by the time they reach the bank. So therefore in Germany, there's a great allergy against inflation. They don't want inflation at all. Therefore, in the Western countries today, when they talk about the target inflation, they talk about 2%. We talk at a much higher level. But the fact is that the history of inflation in some of these European countries was so bad that they have become, as I said earlier, very allergic to inflation. This takes us to the next issue, which is the control of inflation. What do we do in order to control inflation? This is where monetary policy comes in. Monetary policy includes all actions taken by the monetary authorities to influence the availability and price of credit and money. The monetary authority in India is the Reserve Bank of India. The monetary authority in the United States is called the Federal Reserve System. So in England, the authority is called the Bank of England. So the responsibility of the central banks in relation to inflation control has been an important issue that has been debated. As I said, when you look at any policy, there are 2 or 3 things that we need to talk about. One is, what are the objectives of the policy? What are the instruments that are available to the authority to bring about the changes that they want to bring about? And thirdly, the argument is about how effective these actions are. When I talk of monetary policy, what are the other instruments available to the government to control not only inflation, but to control and regulate the economy? One is monetary policy, and the other is fiscal policy, and the third is direct controls, which the government can introduce. For example, if they don't want tobacco to be and cigarettes to be used in the country, they can ban the production of tobacco, for example. Therefore, in the planning days, we always decided certain industries to be preferred over certain other industries and then the action took the form of a direct control. Fiscal policy, as you all know, means all actions taken by the authorities, here the government, in terms of raising revenues and spending. Monetary policy, as I mentioned earlier, includes all policies and actions taken by the monetary authority to influence the cost and availability of credit and money. I will spend a few minutes on how do they do the cost and availability of credit and money. But before that, let me go to another issue, and which is directly related to the control of inflation, and that is issue of the objectives of monetary policy or objectives of the monetary authority. What are the objectives of monetary authority? And this is where some clarity is needed. In fact, the 1935 Act of the Reserve Bank of India said the institution has been set up, and I quote, with a view to securing monetary stability in India and generally to operate the currency and credit system of the country to its advantage. It's a good statement, but it is very vague. It doesn't tell exactly what the objectives of the Reserve Bank of India are. It does talk about securing monetary stability. That can be interpreted to mean price stability. Price stability being the objective of monetary policy. But let me look at some other country. For example, the Federal Reserve System says it has been set up so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rate. Leave out the last one. Maximum employment and stable prices. As you know that these are the issues that are being debated even today in terms of the policy to be adopted at any particular point in time. Growth and price stability are always regarded as the two major objectives of monetary policy. Monetary policy action should be such that it promotes growth and such that it promotes price stability. In fact, when you look at the European Central Bank, it says somewhat differently. The primary objective of ECB shall be to maintain price stability, full stop. Without prejudice to that objective, it shall support the general economic policies in the Union in order to contribute to the achievement of latter's objectives. It puts it somewhat different. It says the primary objective of the ECB is price stability, but it must take into account the need for promoting growth. I think rephrasing what they have said. The modification of the objective a little bit by later on in India was the introduction of the inflation targeting regime. I will come to that later. When an institution has multiple objectives as its goal, what is the problem? The problem is when there is a conflict between objectives. If there are several objectives and all of them can be implemented or can be carried on without any problem, then there is no difficulty. Therefore, multiple objectives raises the issue of whether there are conflicts between objectives. The statement of the objectives must be very clear if we have to make the monetary authorities accountable. Autonomy goes with accountability, and accountability goes with clear enunciation of objectives. In this context, multiple objectives do pose a problem, and economists have discussed at length whether there is a conflict between the objective of growth and the objective of price stability. In a way, in the long run, there is no conflict between growth and price stability. I earlier told you, when we talked about the control of inflation, that one of the reasons why we think of controlling inflation, because high-level rising inflation can affect savings and investment. Therefore, for a steady, sustained long-term rate of growth, perhaps there is no conflict between the two objectives of growth and price stability. But in the short run, that could be, because some people might say that, for example, if we can increase the growth rate by delta, by a small amount, by allowing the inflation to go a little bit, they say that in certain contexts, growth may be preferred. And the objective of the monetary policy could be to push in favor of growth. In the literature on inflation and growth, people talk about what is called the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is, on the vertical axis, you measure inflation. The horizontal axis, you measure the unemployment ratio. And the Phillips curve is a downward sloping curve. That is, what it means is that by allowing a little more inflation, you can cut down the unemployment rate. Now, this Phillips curve has been discussed extensively in the literature in economics. But there is a view that the Phillips curve at best, as I mentioned earlier, may apply in the short run, cannot in the long run. There is an argument that the Phillips curve becomes a vertical line if you look at it from a long-term point of view. So let me get back to the point, because when we come to the actual implementation of monetary policy, this issue becomes critically important, because the critics of monetary policy always talk in terms of what happens to growth and what happens to price stability. Therefore, the question that arises is, how does a monetary authority decide what action to take? Does it look at growth? Does it look at price stability? How does it balance between growth objective and the price stability objective? Therefore, the critical thing about monetary policy is a timing. At what time the monetary authority acts and takes action. Now, before I go to that, let me also make one or two points about what action can the monetary authority take. You hear nowadays about the policy actions of the Reserve Bank of India with respect to the repo rate or which is also called the policy rate. There are 2 or 3 important instruments. Does the central bank have? Does the central bank have in terms of control of inflation? One is adjusting the policy rate, interest rate. The interest rate or the policy rate, when it changes, it is supposed or it is implied that all the other rates in the market will also rise, and it will have an effect on the economy. Now let us see what it is. If the policy rate is increased, what happens? If all the other market rates rise, then it has an inhibiting effect on economic activity, and therefore the demand goes down and the inflation level comes down. This is what happens when the policy rate earlier on, people used to talk about the bank rate, which is the rate at which the central bank lends or borrows from the commercial banks. Let me not go into it. I mean, the point really is that by raising the rate of interest, the central bank tries to bring about a reduction in demand, and through that, it affects the level of inflation. When it wants to stimulate growth, what does it do? Exactly the opposite. It expands the availability of credit, and it lowers the policy rate, and along with the policy rate lowering, it expands the liquidity, and therefore when the interest rate is low, the entrepreneurs, firms are inclined to borrow more, and as a result of this, the aggregate demand expands, and so on. Therefore, the idea behind it was that if inflation is high and if inflation is to be controlled, raise the policy rate. And if you want to stimulate the economy, lower the rate of interest so that it will become more attractive for people to borrow. Yeah, this was put into formulation called the Taylor's rule, where it was said that if the growth rate is lower than the potential growth rate, that is what is the potential of the economy, then you should lower the rate, and the contrary thing when controlling the inflation. Let me get back to India and say a few words about what has been happening. As was initially remarked, there was a long time in which in India's monetary history, the interest rates were all administered in the sense that the Reserve Bank of India fixed the deposit rates, the lending rates of banks. In fact, one of the important things that the banks do these days was actually done by the Reserve Bank, and all banks followed that thing. Therefore, in some sense, you will see that there was no price competition at all among banks, because all of them followed the same announcements made by the Reserve Bank. And after nationalization, most of the banks were also owned by the government, and therefore it had another effect on the way in which the monetary policy was propounded and the way in which the monetary policy operated. One of the reform measures that was introduced in the post-1991 period was to move away from the system of administered interest rates, because interest rate doesn't become a controlling instrument for raising or for influencing the economy. Therefore, and one important thing in this particular situation was what was mentioned also earlier, the government also borrowed from the Reserve Bank of India at a rate which is very low compared to what the market rate would have been. This was through a system called by the issue of ad hoc treasury bills. It will take us some time to explain how that mechanism operates. But one of the early acts that we did I took the initiative to talk to the finance minister, who was Dr. Manmohan Singh at that time, and brought to an end this system of the issue of ad hoc treasury bills, through which had the effect of essentially monetizing the fiscal deficit. So the important changes that have happened since 1991 in the operation of monetary policy is the interest rate instrument came into operation. Open market operations, as we call them, were made possible by the changes in the system. You know what is open market operation? That is, when the central bank of the country, like the Reserve Bank of India, sells a security which it is holding, and then what happens? It pays for it, and therefore the liquidity in the system is increased. But when it sells securities, it sucks money from the system, and therefore it has a contractionary effect. Open market operations are an important tool in with the central bank of our country, and this was not so prior to 1991. Okay. Now, all that I wanted to say is that it is only post reform period, these instruments of credit control and the instruments of changing the policy rate became operational and became effective. Previously, it was almost like what I said earlier about direct control. It is almost like direct control. Somebody said about open market operations as open mouth operations, because they simply dictated what is to be done. Now, in the objective of monetary policy, as I said earlier on, the objective talked about stability. But it also implied, in a sense, that growth is also important, but all this was not specific. Therefore, more recently, what we have introduced is an inflation targeting mechanism, under which the Reserve Bank of India is mandated to maintain the policy, to maintain the inflation rate at 4% with a margin plus or minus to 2%. That is, the mandate to the Reserve Bank of India is to maintain the general price level at 4%, but a flexibility is being given to fluctuate between 2% and 6%. But the amendment to the Reserve Bank of India Act also mentions the fact in the context of the need to promote growth. So that phrase is also there. Therefore, it is not that the Reserve Bank of India's objective is excluded growth. In the context of that need to promote growth, the mandate to the Reserve Bank of India is what I stated earlier. What does it mean? It means that while promoting growth, the Reserve Bank of India has an additional obligation to maintain the general price level rise, the rise of the general price level, and that is inflation, at 4%, but they are given the freedom to fluctuate between, so to say, 2% and 6%. This is somewhat different from the inflation targeting mechanism in some of the other countries. The earliest country to introduce the inflation targeting mechanism was New Zealand. But New Zealand fixed the target at a particular level and did not give any freedom to fluctuate. In the Federal Reserve System, there is no statutory mandate giving it a particular rate. But the Federal Reserve System on its own has stated that 2% inflation rate is their goal. And they repeat it often. So what is exactly the point that I'm, how is this an improvement and how is this operated? I think this is quite clearly important when we talk about the control of inflation. So the point really is high and fluctuating price levels are not desirable for the country. Therefore, a fluctuating inflation and inflation at a high level need to be controlled. In doing so, there are occasions in which the supply side also may require to be managed. And therefore, the supply side management will have to be borne more by the government. The other part is to be managed by the central bank. Let me see now in managing this phenomenon of fluctuating, preventing the fluctuation of price level and holding it in between this level, between some margin. Why the margin? The margin is that any action taken by monetary authority will also take time to get fully implemented, assuming that the action of the monetary authority will bring about the change. Therefore, there is obviously a need to give some freedom to the central bank. And therefore, when the inflation, for example, is fluctuating between 4% and 6%, even though it is above the target level, the implication is the central bank may take some action, but can wait for some time for the inflation to come down to 4%. Therefore, in a sense, what has happened in the recent time and what lessons can we learn from that? I would really like to talk about the recent period in India and elsewhere after COVID-19, or not during COVID-19 and after COVID-19. At the time of COVID-19, what was the problem? The problem was to prevent the spread of the contagion. And therefore, what many countries did is to shut factories and various other economic activities. And in the control of COVID-19, you see two periods. The first period in which they were very strict on closing down factories and other producing units. In the second period, they were more relaxed on that. And therefore, in the first period, the death that occurred because of COVID-19 was less. But in the second period, the death that occurred was larger. But anyway, what happened was, as a means of supporting the people who have been affected by COVID-19, really what was done was to provide relief to them, even in terms of cash dose. India did it, UK did it, US did it. US did it on a very, very large scale. Almost every household received a check. So what happened as a consequence? As a consequence, the fiscal deficit of all these countries increased, and the fiscal deficit could be met only by borrowing from the central bank of the country. And as a consequence, the liquidity in the system increased, the money supply increased in the system, and the price level increased. For example, in 2019, that was, we might call the pre-COVID year, in the United States, the fiscal deficit was 4.67%. In 2020, that was the first year of COVID when the severe action has to be taken. The fiscal deficit of the United States increased to 14.81%. In UK, in 2019, pre-COVID year, the fiscal deficit was 2.2% of GDP. In 2020, the fiscal deficit increased to 12.8%. In India, in 2019, the pre-COVID year, the fiscal deficit of the center and the states taken together was 7.2%. In 2020, the fiscal deficit of India was 13.31. So there was an enormous increase in the fiscal deficit. And obviously that fiscal deficit could not be managed by borrowing from the public. And therefore the central bank intervened. And therefore, what did they do? They also lowered the policy rate. And as a consequence of it, liquidity also expanded. Then the question that arises is, after COVID-19, what do we do? In fact, the fiscal deficit of many countries, including India, remained at a high level for several years. Even today, even last year and even in this year, the fiscal deficit of the federal government is way above the 3% of GDP, which is what is mandated in the Fiscal Responsibility and the Budget Management Act. Therefore, the way in which they met it is by expanding the fiscal deficit, and the expansion of the fiscal deficit and the objective of expanding liquidity resulted in a very large increase in money supply and liquidity. Instead of money supply, I can better use the term liquidity, and that resulted in the price level going up in all countries. To come to an end, so that I leave you some little time for you to ask me questions if you feel like. The point is that there has been some controversy in India about the fact that the policy rate, which was increased to 6.5% in 7th December 2022, because of the need to control inflation, has remained at that particular level. And people have been asking whether is it not time to change the policy rate. That is one controversy that is going on. The other controversy is that much of the increase in the general price level in the recent period has also been due to food inflation. And they say that food inflation cannot be affected by or influenced by the policy rate. Therefore, we should look at not the headline inflation, which is the total inflation, overall inflation, but look at what they call core inflation, that is the headline inflation less the food inflation. Take out the food inflation and compute and look at it. The point is, yes, I think the need to balance the need to promote growth with price stability has become very apparent in the recent developments. The second quarter of the growth rate fell down from the usual 66.5% to something like 5.4%. And therefore, people say that it is time to change the policy rate, that is, bring down the policy rate. This is a matter of perception to some extent. But recently, the Reserve Bank of India also reduced the CRR, that is a cash reserve ratio, that banks are required to maintain. And by lowering it, they also expanded liquidity. In an article that I have written a few days ago, I have indicated that lowering the policy rate is almost equivalent to reducing the cash reserve ratio. Because the point is that when you reduce a policy rate, how does it affect the economy? The Central Bank of India, that is the Reserve Bank of India, cannot simply order interest rate. They just say that the interest rate is lowered. They must take action in order to reduce the policy rate. And the action that they will have to take will be to expand liquidity in the system. It is only, as I mentioned to you earlier, it is only by expanding the liquidity we can bring down the interest rate in the system, assuming the change in the interest rate will have the desired effect. Therefore, in some way, I have argued that the lowering of the policy rate is the lowering of the CRR is almost tantamount to lowering the policy rate. Perhaps the one thing that is lost is the signaling effect, because the signaling effect comes more clearly through the policy rate, because people have been more accustomed nowadays to look at the policy rate and its changes. The point is, yes, when the growth rate slides, you can lower the rate, but at the same time, you will have to look at what are the possible consequences on inflation by such an action. If the view is taken that the danger of the inflation rising to any high level has come down, then the option to stimulate growth is available. This is partly a matter of judgment, and if the point is that the possibility of the inflation rising higher is not there, then the Reserve Bank has greater freedom to stimulate growth by lowering the rate. They must need to keep watching continuously so that to see which um, objective becomes dominant at a particular time. And that is, as I said earlier, partly a matter of judgment. On the food question also, I have to say that is not also very clear. It is not as if, as I mentioned earlier, the inflation is triggered by, or the inflation happens because of the sum of the various policy rates, of the various price levels of various commodities. That's not true. I think it is the macro variable that is critically important. I'd like to quote Milton Friedman again. And he said, in fact, in India, that let me quote, "It is true that the upward push in wages produced inflation, not because it was necessarily inflationary, but because it happened to be the mechanism which forced an increase in the stock of money." Now, what happens is, look at, let me explain a little bit and stop there. The point is, if look at a household. If the household has a fixed income, what happens when the price of one commodity that they consume goes up? Then they will have to, if that commodity is essential, they will spend more. But if they spend more on that commodity, what happens? Less is available for spending on other commodities. Therefore, the demand for the rest of the commodities goes down. And therefore, the general price level is not affected. The increase in the price of one commodity is compensated by the fall in the price of some other commodity. But that is on the big assumption. And that assumption is that the income of the household, the monetary income of the household, remains the same. But that doesn't remain so. What happens is that as Milton said, that as a consequence of it, as a consequence of an increase in one price level, perhaps we are induced to expand liquidity, and it is that expansion in liquidity which affects. Therefore, I would really think that the way to look at is a headline inflation and act accordingly. I would say that the inflation targeting arrangement that we have set up is far more credible and acceptable than the inflation targeting arrangement of certain other countries. By providing for a flexibility in the system of the policy maker having the freedom to fluctuate between 2 and 6%, that our inflation targeting arrangement or the mechanism is far superior. All that is required, I would say, is for the monetary authorities to wisely use the fluctuation that has been allowed. But I would say that the two objectives are correct. I mean, I think one cannot deny the need to promote growth, and one cannot deny the need to control prices. These two become the objectives of monetary policy, and the monetary authorities need to be able to understand when the particular objective becomes a dominant and when the other objective becomes a dominant. That is where the wisdom of the central bank lies. I think I will stop here. If you want to ask me something, then I'm willing to take up the questions.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much for the lucid articulation of such a complex topic on the monetary policy stance. And as you mentioned, central bankers anywhere, their job is not easy to have that growth versus price stability objective. And I keep my reservations before that I open the floor. We will take a few questions from the officers. Over to you. Yeah.
Sir, my question to you is, sir, am I audible?
Yes,
Sir?
I think I'm audible. You put
Yeah.
the question, then I will tell you more.
Sorry, sir. So my question is, sir, you talked about that we should look at the headline inflation, sir. And my question is that should we not focus on core inflation, considering the fact that the food inflation has a different impact and the other inflation has a different impact, so we should tackle them differently and not together, sir?
No, that is what I uh, talked to you towards the end. Now, you see, the monetary policy is looking at the general price level. And the general price level is a key to controlling inflation. There are two things. The people talk about the food inflation. If it persists for a long time, it persists for some time, then it spreads to the other things also. For example, the DA. Then it becomes a kind of cost push in inflation. But leaving aside, I'm not a great favorite of cost push inflation. But the leaving aside that point, what I'm saying is that take for example, take one situation. All right, food inflation is high, and therefore, therefore I am controlling. But I'm looking at the other elements in the basket. Therefore, you expand liquidity. What do you think will happen to food inflation? It will go up further. If we expand liquidity for any reason, it will result in the price of the commodities going up. After all, the whole theory is built on the assumption that the price level can be influenced by expanding or contracting liquidity. So you say, I ignore the food inflation and I look at the others, it's lower, and therefore I expand liquidity. Then you will get a situation in which the food inflation will also further increase. That apart, my point is that is the argument that I put it earlier. If you fix the income, the increase in the price of one commodity cannot lead to an increase in the general price level. It is the reaction to the increase in the price of one commodity by expanding liquidity that will create the problem. Therefore, I would think that whether it is food inflation or any other inflation, if the general price level is high, we really have to act. And that is why I said that the target inflation is 4%. Then you are given the freedom to operate between 4 and 6%. The monetary authority can let, because of the food, then they can allow some more time and take care of it. But if the overall inflation increases beyond 6%, then they must act.
Very good morning, sir. Sir, my question is that looking at the growth figures in India, what are some of the reasons, according to you, that are hindering the growth in India, and what are the reforms that you would suggest, keeping the view of keeping a check on inflation within the range of like 2 to 6%? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Your question is, what is to be done about increasing growth?
Yes, sir. What are some of the ways through which the growth can be achieved? Like, because it's like falling beyond what we are thinking to target.
See, we are now, the year before we had a high growth rate, but much of the increase in the high growth rate in the post-COVID period is due to the lowering of the growth in the previous years, because there was a negative growth rate in 1 year, and that was compensated by a rise in the subsequent year, but not enough, and therefore some of the increase in the growth in the post-COVID period must be towards compensating for the fall in the growth rate in the earlier periods. Therefore, I think the one way of looking at the growth rate is there's a famous equation, Herod-Domar equation, which calls the growth rate as is equal to the investment rate divided by incremental capital output ratio, ICOR, as we call it. That is, you take the position that the driver of economic growth is investment. And therefore, in assessing the growth prospects, you have to look at the investment rate. Therefore, I would say that given the investment rate that we have and the level of incremental capital output ratio that we have, I believe that the potential rate of growth of this economy is between 6 and 7%. I think we can go somewhat comfortably at 6%, but it requires more effort to go to 7%. We need to push up the investment rate and also somewhat lower the incremental capital output ratio. So to summarize what I said in answer to your question, namely that the idea of talking about 8% rate of growth and all that is to my mind not feasible in the near future. I think we should be happy if we can grow continuously at 6.5% year after year. In fact, some calculations show that if we do grow at 6.5% continuously, real growth up to 2047, there is a possibility that India's per capita income can come close to the per capita income of a developed country. But please remember that in that situation, growing at 6.5% for 20 years or 24 years continuously, that has not happened in our past so far. But in the post-reform period, the growth rate picked up. Yes, there was a period in which the average rate of growth of the economy was 7% plus. But subsequently, it fell down also. Therefore, taking into account the investment rate and the incremental capital output ratio, I would say that we can comfortably grow at 6%. With some initiative and so on, probably we can get to 6.5 to 7%.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I have a question. What is, in reality, what is the time it takes to actually time it takes to actually see the impact of the changes that RBI does? Suppose it reduces the policy rate. So how, in what time it sees inflation is getting controlled, and is there any way to reduce it? Because it seems like first bank will reduce their interest rate, and then people will take loan, and then it will impact. So it seems a lot of time.
Well, I think there is a lot in the literature on lags in monetary policy. You are right that when you raise the rate of interest or when you lower the rate of interest, the way in which the system operates is different. Because when the interest rate is raised, the impact of that is more immediate. The on the other hand, when you lower the rate of interest, its impact on the economy takes much more time. As they say, the central banking system or the monetary system has efficient brakes, but the accelerator is uncertain. Therefore, when you lower the rate of interest, whether as a consequence, investment will pick up, and therefore, as a result of it, the growth rate will happen. But when the rate of interest is raised, then people feel the pinch immediately, and therefore they begin to act. I would say that if you want to stimulate growth, the lowering of the rate of interest is, as economists call, a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. I think there are many other actions to be taken by the government and by the entrepreneurs before that effect can be brought about. But there is, in the literature, there is a long discussion about whether the impact of the change in interest rate acts through long-term rate of interest or through short-term rate of interest. There was a big fight between Keynes and Hartley. Keynes always argued that it is a change in the long-term rate of interest that produces the impact on the economy. As you all know, the Keynesian argument is the lowering of the rate of interest expands investment. Investments expand income and output through the multiplier effect. But what Hartley said was that it is a short-term rate of interest which is important. And the way he argued was the short-term rate of interest goes up, immediately affects what he called the inventory holding. That is, the inventory holding is by the factories or by the sellers. And when the rate of interest goes up, and the short-term interest rate goes up, they try to reduce the inventory. And what happens as a consequence? If the inventory holding of the seller is reduced, what happens? The availability of the commodity increases, and therefore it has the desired effect upon inflation. Therefore, there is a lot of literature on what the impact of the interest rate is on various segments of investors. For example, it has been found in the case of housing, people are very careful about the rate of interest because they are committed, in a sense, to pay that rate of interest over a long period. Therefore, when the rate of interest is increased, housing investment gets postponed by the people. So it depends upon many things, but the Hartley effect will be very quick because they immediately act. And there is also the other problem that what is the magnitude of the rate of interest that is required in order to bring about the effect. There was a Radcliffe committee in UK which gave its opinion that small changes in the interest rate do not affect. And they called it the 3 years view. Namely, you have to move from one gear to another gear. If you say there are short, middle, and short, middle, not long, large. Therefore, unless you move strongly, you may not have the effect. So we have to look at all of these factors. Now, for example, if the investment climate is otherwise favorable, if you lower the interest rate, the impact on investment will be quick. If, on the other hand, the investment climate is not that favorable, lowering of the rate of interest may not lead to an expansion in investment. So that is why any action to stimulate growth by lowering the rate of interest must be followed up by the government on acting on many other fronts.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sir, am I audible? Sir, it is often said that the RBI mandate is to manage the inflation and also the growth. But often it is seen that with the change in the interest rate, a debate goes on that the growth is compromised. So how does the RBI, through its committee, decides on?
Can you repeat? Can you repeat?
Sir, it is often said that the RBI's mandate is to manage the inflation rate and also to look into the growth of the country is not compromised. But often with the change in interest rate, a debate goes on that maybe with the higher interest rate, the lending capacity can get compromised. So how does the RBI, through its monetary policy committee, decides on that? What are the deliberations?
No, that is the whole lecture is on that. I mean, namely, what are all the factors that you need to look into? I mean, I think there are two objectives. If the two objectives can be achieved by the same policy action, then there is no problem. It is essentially because pursuing one objective may come in the way of fulfillment of the other objective. And therefore, you have to balance it. What at that particular point, if at the particular point the possibility of inflation is higher, then you use the rate of interest to rise. On the other hand, if you feel that, or you means the central bank feels that it is the other way around, then you lower the rate of interest to stimulate growth. So that is where as I said, the wisdom of the central bank lies. You need to really look at the whole set of factors and see what is more dominant. Is it the possibility of a rise in inflation, or is it the possibility of the lowering of the growth? That is where the judgment is required. But as I said, that the mandate to the Reserve Bank of India is not simply to say that you hold the inflation at 4%. The freedom is given to the Reserve Bank of India to go up to 6%. Now, do you want the inflation in India to go beyond 6%? I don't think that will even be conducive to growth. Between 4 and 6, the Reserve Bank can act anyway. My point is that the inflation targeting mechanism demands a strong action when the country has moved beyond the comfort zone, beyond 2 to 6. That is on the upper side. If it goes beyond 6%, you really have to be the central bank of the country has to be very careful.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much. Our director is traveling on behalf of an IPFP director. Thank you so much, sir, for coming in and talking to us. And it's Golden Jubilee year, which is coming up. So we hope to get back to you again for a series. We will get back to you. And officer, on behalf of the officer, Sparsh will speak to you a few words. Over to you, Sparsh. Sparsh? Yes. Prasenji will speak to you. Thank you so much, sir.
Sir,
Okay.
on behalf of the National Academy of Audit and Accounts and the 2024 batch of Indian Audit and Accounts Service, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to you, sir, for sparing your valuable time to enlighten us on the inflation and the monetary policy. Sir, you have given us much clarity on the inflation, the causes, the concerns that is there with regard to inflation, and also the various instruments that the monetary authority uses to achieve the objective of growth and price stability. Sir, this has been a very fruitful session, and I believe that the learning and the knowledge that we have gained in this session will guide us in our service. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you,
very much. Okay, all the best.